Good evening, Seán, and welcome to Juralex Sedlex. On behalf of our listeners, we would like to say thank you so much for taking your time to discuss your case with us, and we are honoured that you participate in the podcast. So, firstly, we would like to ask you just to introduce yourself for a little bit and to give us a summary of your case, if that's okay.
Sure. Well, thank you both very much for having me on your podcast. It's an absolute pleasure to be here. As for my case, well, I am. What can I say about it? In 2018, I volunteered in search and rescue on the small Greek island of Lesbos, which is a primary entry point for many people who come to seek asylum in Europe, as you're probably very much aware of. And for doing this search and rescue work, I was one night in February of 2018 arrested. I was arrested and detained for 2 days. And in those 2 days, I had to escort the police to my home and to the warehouse of the organization. And they took our vehicles, they took my devices, they searched through my baking flour, they cast a very wide net to try and find some kind of wrongdoing. But we were released pending further investigations 2 days later, and we continued doing search and rescue work. By the we, I mean Sarah Mardini and I, who I presume will be included in the top of this interview. And so we continued to volunteer with the search and rescue organization on the island of Lesbos until we were eventually released again. But this time we were held in pre-trial detention for over 100 days because the supposed crimes that I'm guilty of are so severe. And they include, among other things, being part of a criminal organization, the facilitation of illegal entry, money laundering, fraud for a time, and my personal favorite, espionage. And for all of those combined, we would face a sentence of over 1,000 years and would spend about 20 years in prison. Needless to say, I strongly protest that I have done anything wrong, but we can get into that. That's, I think, a short summary of the case.
Thank you so much for summing it up. It was very interesting also to read about it, especially the point you raised about espionage, which is, so surprising that someone could be charged for espionage by using WhatsApp or like a radio. And we were very surprised by that.
It's almost like it's not supposed to happen.
Yeah.
Funny though, isn't it?
Sure, but
maybe onto something there.
I mean, the espionage charge is a really ridiculous one. So it has, it's wrong for many reasons. In law, it is wrong because under Greek law, the way that the prosecution describes the crime doesn't correlate with what it says in the statute books. And then, in fact, it is also wrong because what they say we did was illegally use encrypted communications services and also infiltrated or listened to encrypted communications. What they mean here, respectively, is our use of WhatsApp, as you said, and also the use of radio frequencies. And as was demonstrated by the Coast Guard, who was handed our maritime radios and asked by the prosecution, can these access encrypted communications? They said no. These are off-the-shelf radios that literally anybody out at sea should be listening to. It is only best practice to be scanning public radio frequencies because on Channel 16, for example, is where you'd expect to hear emergency broadcasts. And any boat in the water should be listening for emergency broadcasts and offering assistance if they're able to do so.
Yeah.
It really is insane when you think about it. It just seems so Dickensian that this could happen in the past, in recent years, Europe, and it just in Europe as well. Like I know that's terrible, but it just, we have this Charter of Fundamental Rights, and like, do we use it? I don't know.
To my case has in fact been spying, but believe it or not, it's the government. The Pegasus files include the use of spy software by the present government on journalists. And so it's a funny old switcheroo.
Yeah, that's an
interesting
twist. Yeah, for sure. If it would be fine with you, it would be very interesting if you could maybe describe the situation in Greece a bit more in detail, because although it's still ongoing, the media coverage of the situation has decreased since 2015, and I think that falsely conveys the impression that the situation is not as severe as it is actually. So could you maybe give us some details, because I think you probably know best about the situation, the ongoing one in Greece.
I should, I think, Georgia, preface my answer by just pointing out that I am very kindly viewed by many people as being an authority on issues that happen in Greece. And this is rightly because, or perhaps wrongly even, this is because my story is constantly in the news. When you search for Greece and migration, Sarah and I often pop up. But that really is more evidence of the fact that we've been very lucky to have media coverage than that I am an authority on the matter. I am not Greece. I haven't lived in Greece for a very long time. And there are others who can speak to I think what is happening in Greece, and they should speak to it because it is horrible. But I am certainly going to give my very shallow and limited perspective on what's happening. But I can contextualize it in my own case, and that'll hopefully give me some authority to speak from. So I think that when one asks, why have you been criminalized? When people I get asked, why is this happening to you? And if you agree with me that I have done nothing wrong, and I think an honest look at the evidence would bring you to that conclusion, then how do these cases happen? And I think that ultimately the criminalization of search and rescue is part of an attempt to try and criminalize the act of seeking asylum. Perhaps not to criminalize it always, but certainly to try and stop it or to prohibit it. The view, of course, has been since the end of Mare Nostrum, which is an Italian search and rescue operation organized by the Italian Navy and was subsequently replaced by a Frontex or a European Border Agency operation, the focus has shifted from search and rescue towards criminalization and towards stopping smuggling. And when we view the act of seeking asylum through the prism of illegal activity like smuggling, we also change the repertoire of policy options that we use to that end. And that is why I think I've been criminalized, because I am viewed not as operating in a search and rescue context, but in the context of illegal border crossings. And so I think my case speaks to the much larger phenomenon, which is that we've hardened our borders in contravention of, I think, our international obligations towards people in distress and the vulnerable. And ultimately, the people who suffer most are, again, those people who are vulnerable. My case, I am a European citizen. I'm German. I grew up in Ireland. But that has brought with it a lot of privilege. Sarah also happens, while not being a European citizen, she's Syrian. She's an incredibly well-known Syrian. I mean, she is effectively a rock star in the humanitarian world. And that comes with it a huge amount of privilege and platform. The vast majority of people who get criminalized for engaging in what the authorities call smuggling or facilitating illegal entry are people who have themselves entered to seek asylum, and no one knows of their case. They are completely unknown. And they are known for a couple of reasons. One, because no one knows that this is happening, because this is more or less no longer in the news cycle. It is happening because there are fewer organizations observing this. And this is partly because criminalization of search and rescue happens. When you criminalize, for example, people like me, it means that others like me don't engage in search and rescue work. And today there is no more formal search and rescue organization on the island of Lesbos. And that also means there are fewer eyes. And with fewer eyes comes more impunity. And therefore we see the criminalization of people on the move.
Just with regards to that, we covered the case of Mohammed Haned Abdi. And we were wondering, is this like a familiar case? Is this a story that you've heard over and over again? Because I definitely didn't. I hadn't heard of this case before. And it seemed absolutely abhorrent to me that this would be happening. And is that a common kind of tale that this is happening?
I'm familiar with Mohammed's case insofar as his case was being heard the day before mine, and I arrived on the island early, and I stood outside the courthouse, I suppose in solidarity or in protest, or however one can see it. And I became familiar because we share mutual friends. But I again, I hadn't been familiar with it beforehand. I mean, from the facts that I know, he, undertook this journey himself, this journey from Turkey to Greece. At a certain point, from my understanding, his boat was abandoned by the person who was operating it, and therefore he took control of the vessel and did his best to safely bring it to shore. And despite his best efforts, lives were lost. And despite that important, traumatic, and necessary experience that he was arrested and charged with being the supposed trafficker of this boat, or the boat captain, as it's often referred to, and was sentenced to, I believe, 140 years.
Yeah.
42 actually, yeah.
142 years.
Yeah.
And, well, it was appealed, from my understanding, and ultimately it was reduced to 8 years. And he walked out of that courthouse a couple of hours with a smile on his face before I went into it. And I mean, the first thing to say is, well, this might seem like a victory, and ultimately having a sentence reduced from 142 to 8 years is excellent news. It is still absolutely an injustice. There's nothing illegal about trying to seek asylum, and which is effectively what he did. And by all accounts, he saved lives on the way. But knowing Muhammad's case or not is unfortunately almost besides the point, because there are so many cases that are unknown. Countless cases. When I was in pretrial prison, I think from the point of view of the layperson is different to prison, but it isn't. I mean, I was, handcuffed to murders and spent time in a cell with convicted felons, and I shared meals with people who have done terrible, terrible things, but also people who have done nothing wrong. People who have been charged with being so-called boat captains because they, exactly like Muhammad, came to seek asylum. And so this repeats itself over and over again. And so, Georgia, when I prefaced earlier that I'm not an expert on this issue, the reason that I think it's so important to say that is, I am afforded this platform. I've had the honor of speaking to you both, and while I won't for a minute diminish that, and I don't mean to criticize anybody for this, but I am offered that position, and most people who are in prison never are. They're completely unknown faces that no one will ever hear, and that's what I mean when I say I don't have that much insight.
Of course, it's due to the privilege you referenced earlier, like the privilege of being born here, being European, and therefore also like entailing those rights. Yeah. But could you maybe speak of, like, what do you think that the motivations are behind such severe sentences, or would that be possible?
I can't speak to it specifically, but to my mind, it is a deterrence in the same way that we see cases opened up. And again, mine is not unique. I mean, there's nothing unique about my case at all. There's almost verbatim charges being leveled against any other search and rescue organization active at Greece's border and indeed Italy's border too. The whole point of those is deterrence. It's to consistently deter. And I think there's a belief that if we criminalize search and rescue, if we criminalize people who would help folks in distress who are experiencing smuggling, then we will stop smuggling, because it would deter people from getting into small boats to begin with. It would dry up the market for smugglers. And the same thing with these horrendous sentences. The longer the sentence, the more people will be deterred. But we aren't seeing that in practice. That isn't true. That isn't acting as a deterrence. And the fundamental policy reason, the impetus for these deterrence policies, these ineffective deterrence policies, is the desperate attempt to try and stop smuggling. And I should, be very clear here. Unlike most policymakers, unlike most people, thankfully, I've actually seen the horrendous conditions that smugglers are pushing people into. I mean, I've seen the tiny dinghies. I have seen little toddlers holding water bottles that have been emptied out and stitched into high visibility fabric to give the illusion of safety when there's nothing at all safe about these awful vessels. And so I agree we should stop smuggling. However, If you truly and in good faith endeavor to do that, then you would not engage in criminalization or deterrence tactics, because the only way you stop smuggling, and this is so obvious, is by offering an alternative to smuggling. If I'm fleeing my home because it is ravaged by war or inequity or something else, then I will try to seek safety. That is a fact, and it is an understandable fact. And smuggling is part of that unless we offer a safe means of seeking asylum.
Do you think that the European Union has engaged in a sort of NIMBYism, so not in my backyard, that their issue isn't actually with smuggling, it's that it's smuggling potentially into the EU, that's what they're more concerned about?
Well, certainly, I think, look, I mean, is it smuggling, or is it the fact that they just want to stop any possible migration into the European territory? I think that ultimately the irony of this is that the European Union will praise the organizations that engage in humanitarian work around the world. This is perhaps a separate point, but let me conclude it
Keep
anyway.
going. Yeah.
That the European Union praises the organizations that do rescue work around the world, but the very same organizations, take, for example, the MSF or Médecins Sans Frontières, or Doctors Without Borders, they will be in operation in, I don't know, pick a country, a third country, and the European Union will hold them up as champions of our European values. Now, as it happens, MSF has had search and rescue operations in the Mediterranean, doing the exact same things, only within or close to the European border, and have now been described as criminals, as engaging, in their case, I think, breaking some kind of pollution law in the ocean. You know, whatever sticks is thrown at folks who, frankly, try to observe fundamental human rights. And so I think it isn't so much about what exactly the issue is. Not exactly about what motivates organizations or the smuggling per se, but it is about the fact that people are crossing into the border, and that is not wanted.
I think this like preferential treatment or this double standard is also very visible if you consider like the cases of Ukrainian refugees entering the EU and how they are perceived by European countries versus how people entering from the Mediterranean Sea are perceived by European countries. We were wondering, as someone who has worked as an aid worker, how do you perceive this like preferential treatment, and what do you think are the reason for that? Because it's not anymore in our own backyard. I mean, Ukrainian people are also entering the EU, of course. So why is there still like this preferential treatment?
Yeah, I think that's true. There clearly seems to be a difference in treatment between people who are fundamentally doing the same thing, fleeing war and persecution. The question then, of course, is why. I think at this point, conversations that I've had have often led to finger pointing and saying, well, this is just an expression of racism. This quite clearly is racism. And while I don't doubt that can be part of the story for some people in what motivates them to engage in this preferential treatment, I don't think it captures the full picture. And I find it also to be quite polarizing. I think that it is important with answers like this, and I'm going to give you a kind of vague and slippery answer, I think, that we don't worsen or heighten the polarization around migration. Migration is a polarizing topic.
Yeah.
And the fact that Ukrainians are being supported is good. It is good.
Yeah.
And it should be a yes and conversation, and not a well, if they can't, we can't kind of conversation.
Yeah.
I think one reason why, and I don't know for sure, but one reason why, based on the conversations that I've had, that some folks will support Ukrainians and not particularly support others, is the heuristic we use, or the frame of reference, or the narrative that shape our perception of the folks who are ultimately seeking asylum in Europe. I gave as an example here someone I was neighbours with in Ireland, someone who's very lovely, but we disagree on our politics. And one thing that we disagree on is that people from the Middle East, North Africa principally, have a right to seek asylum. And the frame of reference that is brought to bear to deny folks like that right to seek asylum is, well, the war on terror. And we bring to the conversation all our baggage and our misunderstanding and our fear, and sometimes legitimate, but mostly not legitimate, that the people who seek asylum are not good people, or that they're dangerous, or that whatever you have, the frame of reference for people from the Middle East and North Africa is the war on terror.
Mm-hmm.
While the frame of reference we have for Ukraine, for better or worse, is the Cold War. And it is that Russia is an enemy. And it makes it very easy to understand in that narrative who the enemy is, Russia, and who the victim is. And that is, of course, Ukraine. And we would open our arms to that victim. I think in the war on terror conversation, it is more complex. It is, or they're both complex, but unfortunately we have had very reductive conversations that are imbued with decades of war on terror, racism, and Islamophobia, and what have you. And this, I think, goes some way in explaining why this is happening. But of course, it isn't legitimate just because someone holds a bad view of people from the Middle East and North Africa doesn't mean that they don't deserve to seek asylum. Those should be two different conversations. We should be able to have that nuanced discussion. But I'm afraid that we don't seem to be able to have that conversation.
The EU is often stylized, or has stylized itself, I think, as a defender of human rights. But I know it was Council of Europe, but the EU has a staunch kind of protection for the ECHR, and then of course the EU has the Charter of Fundamental Rights. I'm really getting to use my LLB here. So we were wondering that, do you think that the EU has lost its kind of moral compass to a certain degree after what you've been through? Do you still believe that the EU emphasizes the protection of human rights?
It's probably not so black and white. It probably isn't that it never does or always does. What I've learned, though, is that the EU's willingness to apply, when it decides when it or does not apply them, is not very principled and more convenient.
Okay.
I don't think it is at all surprising that the EU finds it easier to be the flag bearer of human rights and the rule of law when in third countries. And I can see that in practice. I think the EU, or at least some of its member states, and by extension, therefore, the EU, find it difficult to apply those very same human rights and the rule of law internally. And so it's a mixed picture, I suppose. But certainly it is ironic that the EU, which goes around the world talking about human rights and the rule of law, cannot apply its own rules. I think one thing that I often get, and I've labored this point perhaps often enough, but the irony that the European Union will talk about these human rights and will frame people. I'm thinking here specifically of, say, some southern member state leaders, folks like myself, probably like you, as being, very young and very naive, being in some way utopian, wanting more than the European Union can do or ever said it would do. And in making those statements, occupy, I think, the realpolitik position and frame us as naive.
Yep.
Of course, the picture is almost diametrically opposed to that vision. It is that we are upholding only what the European Union, as you've already outlined, has said it would do. I mean, I would, throw in the Council of Europe here too, because all the EU member states are members of the Council of Europe. But you have, therefore, the responsibilities of a country that tries to uphold the rule of law, that tries to ensure that the principle of non-refoulement is observed, the principle that people have the right to seek asylum, that they're not going to be left to drown or to die. They are all signatory states to the various maritime conventions that require us to provide search and rescue, or indeed the right to a fair trial. All of these things are not naive statements of mysterious origin. These are ratified pieces of legislation, of conventions that the European Union and its member states have all signed up to, and therefore all we're asking is that they do their goddamn job. And that isn't naive. To think that we can afford to live in a world in which we don't do so. To live in a world where our obligations are meaningless or only to be put into practice when it is convenient, that is naive, because that is what comes with real costs.
I think it's also interesting as well. If you take the genesis of the EU as like the European Community of Coal and Steel, that's unrecognizable as what we have today. So I think I completely agree with you in that what they're saying, that we're naive and that we're not thinking about the EU as what it can actually do, and we're asking too much of it. But this is not in any way what the EU says it's doing right today is not in any way what it was set up to do. So I think we can predict where it's going to grow and how us as EU citizens want it to grow, and I think we should dictate that to the EU as opposed to have it the other way around. They can't turn around and say to us, actually, no, these rights that we have afforded to you, they don't apply to everybody, you know?
Yeah, we should not regress, but actually it should evolve into more, into what it could be, of course.
But even if we contextualize the coal and steel community, I mean, its whole purpose was to try and avoid war in the European continent. It was exactly to try and ensure that atrocities, that the derogation on principles of fairness and arguably the proto rule of law frameworks were to be upheld so that we don't descend into lobbing grenades at each other, which is, again, the reason that the coal and steel community was first set up. And the coal and steel community must be contextualized within the other frameworks, international fora that were established at the time, including convention rights, the ones enshrined that we're talking about today. I mean, these are not some modern wokarati liberal snowflake principles that have been dreamed up by university students last week. These are fundamental principles that were first established by Churchill, of all people, by people in the beginning of the past century who thought rightly that this was important.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think our interview is kind of almost unfortunately over. If that would be fine with you, going to the last two questions, if that suits you.
Please.
Okay, perfect. Did you experience discouraged from being an activist, and why do you continue your work despite the high stakes? You mentioned earlier you would have to face maximum sentence prison. So why do you continue your work and activism?
There's no noble reason for that, honestly. It is, in my case specifically, because I have no other choice. I am not engaged in search and rescue, for example. My activism has now become very selfishly a fight for survival outside of a prison wall. And I think, therefore, I don't have much choice. If I'm silent now, then if, for example, we did not have the platform that we have, if we did not fight for our human rights, and by extension, almost incidentally, other people's human rights, then we would possibly still be in pre-trial detention or worse. And so, from my perspective, yes, I face severe criticism and danger, but I face that more if I don't do something. And I think that probably speaks to the wider reason why others should engage in this conversation. If I go to prison, it'll be very sad for myself, and I will not be very pleased, but ultimately that doesn't really matter. What matters is that if I go to prison because I used WhatsApp, because I pulled someone from the water, because I helped somebody who was at risk of being hurt, then the next time you do exactly that same thing, and I'm confident that both of you and every listener listening to this podcast would also do that thing, then they will also face, potentially, trial and potentially prison. Because what is at stake here is the idea that the rule of law exists, that the human rights exist. I am not on trial. The rule of law and human rights is on trial. And that is why we keep going, fundamentally. It's all just on that issue. Sorry, if I can just expand on that. There was I interpreted a question in a specific way, but it could have been interpreted why engage in search and rescue work more. And the answer would be very similar. We should do it because no one deserves to drown. It doesn't matter if you are eventually granted asylum or otherwise, even if you're not granted asylum because you ended up merely being an economic migrant, as it were, still means you don't die. But I think it's worth noting that, I don't engage in search and rescue, and I want to state why. I don't engage in search and rescue now because I am no longer skilled at it. And it's really important. People often ask me, what can I do to get involved? And I imagine perhaps this was possibly your last question. What can people do to get involved? Our guiding principle should be to do no harm. And part of unpacking that principle is also asking, am I the right person for this? Am I still the right person for this? And if I honestly ask myself that question, should I be doing search and rescue? Am I the right person for it? Then of course the answer is no, I haven't done search and rescue in years now. I'm very seldomly on ribs, very seldomly polishing up my search and rescue routines and rope work. If I did it now, it'd be for ego. And that's the wrong reason to get involved. It's the absolutely wrong reason for getting involved in this work. And so I engage in human rights work or activism more broadly on a level that I hope does no harm and that is hopefully motivated for the right reasons. And I think that is the main concern that we should have. And then whatever we can do within that is honors that principle, then we should do it. And I think that we have this idea that search and rescue work or other very showy and demonstrative acts of solidarity are important acts of solidarity. And while I think they are, they're not the only ones that are important. It is equally valuable to look in your fridge and to see a meal that you don't need to eat and give it to someone that is hungry, for example. It's not very demonstrative, it's not very showy, but it is an act of solidarity that is equally as important. And so anywhere on the spectrum where you feel that you can offer help that does no harm, then I think that's how people should get involved in this work.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. That's fantastic.
Yeah.
I'll let you...
Very inspiring words as well.
Yeah.
That's very true though. Because sometimes I think one has the feeling that no matter what they do won't be enough. But I think what you just said, like small acts of solidarity are also very important.
Yeah.
And we all should maybe include them a bit more in our lives.
Absolutely. Definitely.
Yeah, I mean, it's a low bar, and I say it partly as, to shine a light in my inaction as well. There's plenty of things that I don't do that I could do more of. I don't think that all of us have to spend all of our time doing things, but I certainly don't do as much as I could. That would be, a very low expenditure of energy on my part that could be meaningful to somebody else.
Okay.
Thank you so much. I mean, that was a very inspiring end note, I would say.
Yes, thank you.
Or would you like to add anything else? Would you like to come back to another question or?
Not necessarily. I think that we've covered a good amount of ground, and I usually just spit out loads of tropes here or punchlines, and I'm just not going to do that because it's cringy and awful. Thank you for your time, is what I will say.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, we have to thank that.
Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, really, that you took the time to talk to us and discuss this very interesting case. And of course, you wrote that in your mail. It wasn't just your case, but the case of 24 or 23 other humanitarian workers, but aid workers. I'm very sorry. It's very, very inspiring to talk to you, and yeah, we admire what you did very much.
No problem. I love the sound of my own voice. I'm always.
Yeah,
as do we, evidently.
Yeah. Otherwise, you wouldn't be wearing those beautiful headphones.
Comes with the territory, doesn't it?
Yeah, very much. So thank you so much for talking to us this evening, and we hope that the listeners have enjoyed, because we certainly have. So
it was very inspiring to talk to you, and very interesting as well to hear your case again from yourself, of course. Yeah.
Girl, made them all got to think. So yeah.
On the road. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much.
Bye.